So I decided I was going to make an idle clicker, but I always found those kind of games lacking a certain choice, because they're all relatively linear, as there isn't anything outside of the upgrades that you can really spend your resources on. These games always felt like they were a secondary system that needed to be added to another game, similar to a leveling system in an RPG. The benefits of a leveling system in an RPG are that it can give players long-term goals, as well as reward players for doing well. The leveling alone is not the incentive, but the effect on the core gameplay is. When implementing a new system into a game, or at the very least trying to combine genres, you have to make sure the system matches the rest of the experience. By this, I mean that you need to find the similarities between the two gameplay styles and how the player interacts with that. A really good example of this is the inventory system in Resident Evil 4, as they introduced a new system that wasn't really in any of the other games. Effectively, it was a grid-based storage system that was a little bit more complex than the original trilogy. By making it so complex was that it raised a lot of questions in the player's mind about how much they could carry and how much they could fit inside of the bag in a far more organic way than just adding an encumbrance system. When you combine the core gameplay with the inventory system, it helps enhance that core feeling of suspense and survival, as you had to make sure you weren't picking up too many resources, but you were also making sure you were accessing the most amount of resources you could that you didn't have ammo for. Equally, you didn't want to carry ammo that you didn't have guns for. The best game series, or at least game genre I could find that was in my kind of wheelhouse, but was also similar enough to the style of idle clicker I was thinking about, would be something like a 2D RTS. If you're not familiar with what I mean, it's one of those 2D flat RTSs where the players come from the left hand side and the enemies come from the right hand side, and it's all about the player selecting certain characters, but they don't necessarily have a lot of control over the movement or where they're going. You just kind of have to let them go. But usually you have some control over what you spawn, or at least choosing what you spawn. Both systems share a certain distance from the action as well. Idle games often ask the player to automate the resources so that they can idly pick up all of the resources they would have to do physically. Equally, the players of a 2D RTS are expected to select units that they will not have control over and have a certain distance from the actual combat, despite spawning specific characters. And by this I mean you could argue that the player is attempting to automate the process of the combat. Okay, so now we can get to the fun part, and by that I mean the more design and development focused stuff. So the idle section should act like a deck builder in a TCG. The player has to get the resources to spend during the RTS state. The way I envision this is it's similar to a TCG in the sense that this would be you buying your cards, opposed to what you usually do in an RTS, or at least the 2D ones, where you slowly accrue these resources as the game progresses. Instead, this would happen all in one big stage beforehand. You would just have cooldowns on the times you can spawn units. The core gameplay of this section revolves around brewing more goblins and storing them in tanks. So there'll be these big tanks that you will be able to store the goblin juices in, and this will then act as a resource that then you can use. But you can't just use the brewing elements as storage. This incentivizes the player to always pay attention to what is going on brewing wise, so they're bucketing stuff out. Equally, it always means they've got something to do regardless of how far they are into the game. The RTS stage has quite a chaotic kind of feel to it, or should do, as they're goblins, and I don't necessarily want to give you too much control over them in terms of thinking that you have full control over them, as they're kind of more of a horde of rambling special ed students. So to give this feeling, I want to make it so that the goblins don't really start with equipment, but they have to search for equipment as they see enemies. Now this isn't necessarily in the control of the player. In fact, it's not in the control of the player at all. As long as the goblin is active, the goblin will be looking for stuff. In terms of what they can find, the goblins can find 4 weapons. So these will be shields, swords, spears, and bows. I couldn't think of a bow that started with S. Slings? Ah, fuck it, I'm too late now. I don't want to animate a sling. No. Each weapon sets the combat behaviour for that goblin, and by that I mean how they'll act isn't necessarily dictated by some kind of class, but is dictated by the weapon they pick up. For instance, shields go straight at the front, and they have a higher health than everything else. However, they don't actually deal any damage. Swords have a minor boost to health, but only have a range just in front of them in terms of attack. Spears are behind the swords and the shields, and they will attack enemies that are directly in front of them. They'll also attack enemies that are just behind the current line of enemy. And the idea behind this is that goblins won't attack the same enemy, they'll attack ones that are unoccupied, meaning that the spear users will be able to occupy that back row, meaning that the damage will be spread out more equally amongst the enemy ranks. The last weapons are the bows, and they are slightly different from everyone else, in the sense they look at all of the enemies and look for the ones with the lowest health and start attacking them. Initially this will be the back ranks, but as the combat continues they'll then start attacking units more inside of the main ranks. Now, as much as there's a lot going on in terms of combat, I think it's safe to say there's not really that much player choice apart from how often they spawn the goblin, which even then isn't really directly within their control. So to expand the player's options, I thought that there needed to be new goblins, so that could be organised inside of the idle stage. The idea for this was that the player could take the usual white goblin juice and it could separate into 3 colours, these being the 3 primary colours: red, yellow and blue. And this would give you 3 new goblin types. The question was, how exactly do you design those goblins? So when designing these goblins, I wanted to make sure that they still stuck to that chaotic feeling of not necessarily giving the player too much control, but I thought that at this stage the player might have a better understanding of the mechanics and would therefore need some way of stacking the deck in their favour, as it were. So I decided to give these goblins 2 core features. The first would be that they would be able to select what type of weapons they wanted to use, and the second part would be that they would have some kind of stat increase, if anything. So the yellow goblins have an extremely high speed in terms of movement, but they have a preference for bows and shields, and the idea for this is that they're meant to kind of support. They can draw the battle lines very far to the enemy side very early on, but aren't necessarily there to fill out the main damaging rank. Equally, this might give the player the wrong idea that they're meant to attack really quickly, when in reality they're trying to build out their ranks to take the enemy out over a long time, or a longer time than just running straight in. The red goblins have a high damage, but they only use spears and swords. This is so they can fill out the damage areas. Most likely because if the player wants to maximise the amount of damage they can do, they want to make sure that their ranks are being filled in these damaging areas. You can't necessarily control for that, but you can control for it if you spawn the red goblins. The blue goblins have the highest search range, so they'll have the highest vision cone in terms of spotting enemies, so they'll start scavenging a lot earlier. The difference is that the blue goblins will not pick up a weapon that is low quality, and by that I mean a weapon that has a low crit chance. Now, the blue is probably the weirder one out of the 3, because it doesn't necessarily have any specific space it's meant to fill, because it's not necessarily filling the role within the ranks, it's actually doing something slightly different. You see, when the blue goblin searches through the crap on the ground and it finds stuff that it doesn't like, it'll just chuck it. What this means though is that other goblins can come and pick up those weapons without the search time. Not only does this save search time, but it also means you can predict what goblins are going to pick up as they go along. So for instance, you'll see a spear on the ground and you'll think, oh, I'll send out a red one to pick that one up. It's important to understand that none of these actually give the player more control, they just let the player influence the battle more. So other than that, that's all I have really planned. I did want to put in a colour mixer at some point, but that is going to have to be something that I do like in the last few weeks. I don't necessarily want to start doing that straight away. The colour mixer would effectively give the player 3 new options in terms of what they could use, and I would make these very, very specific and give... They wouldn't necessarily be able to deal as much damage or do things as important, but they would be able to really experiment with what you could do within the game. For instance, I was thinking that you could have an orange goblin, which would be the combination between a yellow and a red, which would have the speed and the cowardice of a yellow, but it would also have the aggressiveness of the red, meaning that it could effectively sneak around the back and start stabbing them in the ankles. Plus, I think that would give the player a little bit more variety in terms of what's going on. Although I may make it so that the drawback to that is that the player loses a rank in terms of... I'm already designing stuff now. Suffice to say, I have ideas, but ideas are very cheap, and programming and making stuff is hard. So other than that, I think that's it. I'll probably update people over the week on Twitter probably, and I'll probably do a live stream some point throughout the month, just to keep anyone who's interested, which is all about 0 people. I'm so sad, please subscribe. Oh yeah, I'll be posting this on Itch as well, once it's complete, or at least once the month's up, so I'll have to at least have something by the end of it. The fucking ice cream truck, man. This thing fucking haunts me. It's not gone.